Well, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jonathan Truitt. I am a pastoral ministries major here at Welch College, and I also serve as the student body chaplain for this semester. And it is my privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Bruce Ashford to you today. If you were not able to make it last night, he gave a very, very good sermon in last night's service. And so I would encourage you that if you were not here last night to go back on the live stream and watch it. It can be found on either on the Facebook page or on the website. And I would encourage you to go back and watch that sermon if you didn't get the chance. Dr. Ashford is currently serving as the Provost at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he lives in the greatest state in the United States, and that would be North Carolina. And so it is my honor to introduce him to you today, and so he'll be coming to speak to us about Marxism. Dr. Ashford.
Well, good morning and welcome back. Appreciate you showing up this morning. So Marxism, why the topic? Well, for me personally, a few different reasons. So I'm 45 years old, and that means that when I was growing up, when I was a small child, and turned on the television and watched the news, often the news was about the Soviet Union. And I remember also that my parents received in the mail 4 times a year a publication called the Prisoner Bulletin. And it was a bulletin that had photographs of emaciated Christian pastors, or just Christian people, and photographs of concentration camps, and told the personal story and the history of different pastors and Christians who had been ripped from their homes, put in concentration camps, assassinated by the Soviet government, and so forth. And so it always really, it stuck in my mind. Then my parents gave me a book called Tortured for Christ. And it was a story of Richard Wurmbrand and how he had been put in 14 years in prison for being a Christian and 3 years of isolation, and detailed his treatment at the hands of Nicolae Ceausescu. And I was fascinated with that part of the world. And then in 1998, I went to live in Russia. This was after the Soviet Union had collapsed, and I lived there for 2 years, from 1998 to 2000. And I got to see sort of the devastation that was caused by the Marxist utopia that had been implemented in Russia and the surrounding states. I saw that and heard from the Russian people how their liberty had been decreased and their poverty had been increased by Marxism. And so then I came back to the United States, and I've taught at the undergrad level intellectual history for about 19 years now, which is tracing ideas and their consequences. So I want this morning to talk about Marx's ideas and the consequences of implementing those ideas. It's an interesting time to talk about Marx because you have some self-proclaimed socialists running for office in the United States. Now, Bernie is not really a socialist. He calls himself a socialist, but he's more of a social democrat. He's still a capitalist. He loves capitalism because he earns a pretty good penny off of the capitalist system. But he is a heavy distributionist. He's leaning in a socialist direction. Now, AOC and other people like the Democratic Socialists of America, they're real socialists. They want to hand over all utility companies to the government, and they want to implement a real sort of socialist society. Now, so, there are many versions of socialism. Marx was not the first socialist, and he certainly wasn't the last, but Marx is the most important socialist in history. He's probably the most influential person in history apart from Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad. Probably. He and Freud are next in line after Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad. So he's an extraordinarily influential man whose ideas have affected hundreds of millions of people. So here's what I want to do today. I want to, first of all, summarize Karl Marx's life and his way of thinking. Then I want to show that he had, I think, good intentions, but the system that he came up with has been absolutely disastrous whenever it's been implemented in a serious way in any part of the world. And I want to argue that Marxism functions as a false religion, not as an economic theory. That it actually functions as a false religion, that it's a holistic way of viewing the world and seeing it, and that it seeks to provide a salvation that is brought about by people precisely because Marx believed there would never be a salvation brought about by God. And then finally, I want to show some of the contradictions and negative consequences that are inherent to Marxism. All right, so how much time do I have today? I forgot. Do I have 45 minutes, or anybody remember? 45. All right, well, I'm going to try to talk a little bit less than that so that we have time for Q&A. We'll see if I can do that. Professor, I'm long-winded. Okay, if needed. So Marx was born into a Jewish family. His father was a well-known lawyer. He briefly converted to Christianity when he was a teenager, and he wrote some pretty decent prose about Christ, like high praise for the person of Jesus Christ. But he moved, he started at the University of Berlin, where he studied philosophy, and he became enamored with some pantheistic and atheistic philosophers, Hegel and Feuerbach to be precise, and quickly became an atheist. And after that moved to France with his wife Jenny, and there in France he experienced for the first time serious poverty, and several of his children died, and Marx lived right at the just above the poverty line for most of his life. And part of that is his fault because he spent all of his time writing and didn't do the work that he needed to do to earn money. But he did genuinely see some awful things that were happening to working class people as the modern capitalist system emerged. And he was right to recognize those things wrong. Factory owners were abusing their workers, making them work 12, 14, 16 hours a day to barely live at the poverty line. They had children, 6 and 7, 8 years old, working 12 hours a day, and these were some genuine abuses of a free market system. So Marx set about trying to figure out what it was that was going on and how to fix it. And the solution that he came up, I think, with was disastrous. So let's describe it for just a minute. I want to describe his system of thought now. You know, Marx's name gets tossed around quite a bit, and people often don't understand what he actually thought. So I'm going to give several categories here to describe his thought. The first is his understanding of history. So Marx was an economic determinist, or something close to an economic determinist, meaning that the logic of human history can be, meaning that history is determined by economic factors, and that if you can understand the logic of human history if you trace economic factors and how they developed. And in particular, he said, you want to look at the struggle between human beings and nature, and the struggle between those who have a lot of material goods and those who don't. Now, he believed that history, and so if you're looking at history economically, he believed that history had 4 stages, and that it would have one more stage. All right? So he believed that there was the Asiatic stage. This is the hunter-gatherer stage, and this is what the economy was. You had people that hunted or gathered, and that's how you got your food. And people struggled because they were at the mercy of nature. Then you had the ancient stage, and this was the slave-master stage. You had some people who owned other people, and the people who were owned were at the mercy of the people who owned them, rather than being at the mercy of nature. And then in the medieval era, you had the lord-peasant relationship. This was a little bit different than the slave and slave owner relationship, because the serf who worked for a lord, the peasant who worked for a lord, got a little bit more of the fruit of their labor. And it was better for the owner too, because their property wouldn't just run away overnight or get sick and die. That the peasant had a vested interest in his land that he worked on. So that was the third stage. The fourth stage was capitalism. And in capitalism, what you have is you have the owner and employee relationship. And as Marx saw it, with the owners abusing the employees. But Marx believed that the next thing that would happen, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is that there would be, next era would be the communist era. There would be a revolution. The working class people would overthrow the owner class, and they would begin to flourish at such a level that you would no longer even need a government, that the government would fade away, and you would end up with a utopia where all people were equally wealthy and where basically evil disappeared. There'd be no need for the state to be there to coerce, to have a police force, to have militia, because human beings' deepest problem isn't that they have sin in their heart, is that they don't have enough material goods. And so he wanted to help bring this sort of salvation to humanity. So what was his anthropology? What was his view of the human being? Now listen, when you're looking at an ideology, one of the most important things you can do is to ask, how does this ideology or religion view the human being? And Christianity is the only religion or ideology that believes that the human being has evil in their heart, and that our fundamental problem is evil, and that we need to be saved from it. Every other religion and ideology views the fundamental human problem as something other than that, a lack of knowledge. Muhammad and Socrates both believed that what we need is not a savior, but a prophet or a philosopher who can correct our way of thinking. And if you correct a human's way of thinking, then of course they'll live the right way. So the problem isn't evil, the problem isn't the will, the problem is just the knowledge. Or other ideologies, progressivism, and believe that the evil is located in institutions, right? And so if you can, and primarily the nation state, or strong forms of religion, or warped legal institutions, at the institutional level, that's where evil is, okay? So what did Marx believe? He believed that human beings are at heart not created in the image of God, but created in the image of a laborer. That at the bottom, who we are is we're laborers. We're people who earn money and get stuff. And so if we're being oppressed at the economic level, if our working environment is not good, then we're being crushed at the very nature of who we are. Now, he also believed that human beings were not free thinkers, that we are determined by our economic class and status. So what was his critique of capitalism? He believed that capitalism undermined human dignity because it created and caused bad working conditions for the working class. He believed that capitalism alienates us from the product of our labor, and to some extent that's correct. There's going to be some truth to a lot of what Marx has to say, but when you tie it all together in a theory, it's an awful theory. How does it alienate us from our labor? Think about it. Back in the old days, hundreds of years ago, you were a farmer and you grew vegetables, for example, and then your family ate those vegetables. And the ones that were left over, you took them to the market and you sold them to your neighbors, and you could see how you were helping people. Or you were a tailor, or you cobbled shoes, or whatever you did, your family benefited from it and your neighbors benefited from it, and there was some real satisfaction. But in the capitalist era, you sat in a factory and you hammered a nail every time a product came through, or you sewed a seam, and you never even got to wear the clothes that you made, or use the product that you were making in the factory, and you also never got to complete the product and give it to somebody. So very dissatisfying, can be a very dissatisfying way of making a living, and Marx recognized that. He also said that capitalism alienates us from the process of labor, that in a capitalist era, you can't control your own working hours. Now remember, he's thinking about factories a couple hundred years ago, and there were some pretty bad conditions, and workers couldn't control how long they worked. They had to work for 12 or 14 hours a day, and they couldn't take a break whenever they wanted to. And he also said that capitalism alienates us from authentic existence because of these processes. So then he prophesied. Marx viewed himself a prophet. Turned out to be a pretty bad prophet. But he believed that capitalism would implode, basically, that it would collapse because it was such a bad system, and that what would happen is working class people would gather together to forge a revolution, and that certain of the wealthy class would peel off and be a traitor to their own class and would help the working class have their revolution. So in other words, capitalism would dig its own grave and fall into its own grave. Then he believed what would happen is that that basically things would go so well once this wealthy and poor bifurcation had been dismantled, that people would flourish and be equally wealthy and the state would wither away. Isn't that funny when you think about Marxism's actual historical iterations? The state has never withered away in Marxism. It's become enormous and oppressive, and people have never flourished. Whenever Marxism has been implemented, people have become equal materially, and they've become equally poor, except for the top 10% of the 1% who are enormously wealthy, and that would be the leadership class the governing class. So let's ask, where can we agree with Marx? And then I'm going to try to show you why Marx functions as a false religion. But first, why would I even want to talk about where we might agree with Marx, or where he might have right insights? Here's why I want to do that. Every false ideology and false religion has true insights and shared concerns with us, and that's precisely because Satan doesn't have his own facts. He has to work with God's facts. He never created anything. And so he has to take aspects of God's world that God created and make an ideology out of them. And that ideology twists those facts in the wrong direction, but there still are true insights. And think about it. An ideology is something, it's a full system of thought that elevates something other than God and puts it on the throne. All right? So it idolizes something. And in Marx's case, we're going to see it's material equality, right? But precisely because ideologies idolize something and obsess on something other than God, they're going to certainly have some insights that come from the thing that they obsess on. Freud obsessed on sex and had some real insights into it. Marx obsessed on the economy and its relation to working class people and had some true insights. And every false religion and every ideology is going to have some true insights, but when put into a larger whole, those insights are twisted in bad directions. So, Marx did seem to have some genuine compassion for people who are in poverty, and it is right to have compassion for people who are being abused by immoral owners, factory workers that are working people in a way that oppresses them and hurts them, and people who have no real choice at doing anything else and have to remain abused at the hands of those workers. Capitalism becomes a bad system when you have immoral people running it. Free market only works well to the extent that people are relatively moral. He was right that we should work for humans to treat them with dignity. He was right that we should value labor. He was right that we should fight against immoral agents working in a free market system. So he was right about some things. But his solution was positively awful. Now, what Marx did when he became an atheist is he in his mind, he said, so God any solace with that, we're going to have to bring a salvation in the here and now. And when he built Marxism, he built it on the model of a biblical salvation, as if he had the Bible at his left elbow as he was typing up Marxism. He sat at his typewriter. You know, he got up and fixed his beard and oiled it and had his breakfast and sat down on the typewriter and came up with a system that is the converse of Christianity. And I want to talk about that for just a moment, and then I'm going to show you how it functions exactly like a religion. So in any false ideology, something has been idolized, right? Some aspect of the created order that is a good aspect of the created order has been elevated to the level of God. They've ascribed ultimacy to it. They've absolutized it. And they're going to trust in that element and love that element and obey that element in the way that only God should be trusted, loved, and obeyed. And for Marx, that is material equality and common ownership of property. For him, that was the number one goal that we should work toward, is for there to be material equality. So I think that's a bad God, first of all. To put anyone other than God on the throne is bad. And then even as a penultimate goal, material equality per se is not what we're after. I think what Christians want is flourishing. It's not that we should all want to be equal materially. It's that we should want all human beings as much as we can to be able to flourish. We want to be able to set the conditions economically where people can flourish and do well. Even in the new heavens and earth, humans aren't going to be equal. I mean, ontologically, we're equal before God. We have equal worth and value, but we won't have material equality. I mean, there's hints that we won't even have that in the new heavens and earth, where we're told that some people will have more crowns than others, right? And some people will sit closer to Jesus than others. And yet at the same time, there won't be any jealousy or dissatisfaction. All of us will flourish on the new heavens and earth, but we're not guaranteed material equality. That's not like an ultimate goal. Underneath our ultimate goal of God, our goal is flourishing rather than equality per se. I mean, aside from ontological equality, we're just not equal. Some people are short, some people are tall, some people are big, some people are little. Some people's brains work better and other people's brains work worse. Some people are good athletes, some people are not. I mean, it's just, we're not equal, and we can't force it to be the case. I mean, it'll never work. Marxism is also a totalizing ideology. It's radical and total and comprehensive. It's radical in that it seeks to reconstruct society from the roots up, and it's totalizing in that it includes every sphere of culture. Now, the Bible, I think the Bible, there are two ways politically to try to make a nation a better nation. One is through reform, and the other is through revolution. Marxism and progressivism want a revolution. They want to clear the deck socially because they have confidence that the things that have gone wrong in our society have nothing to do with the human heart and have everything to do with systems. So they're more confident in the condition of the human heart. They're also very confident in the condition of the human brain because they believe that we can clear the deck socially and that we can get our smartest people together and replan society and implement entirely new systems, and that those new systems will do really well. But historically, when humans have tried to do that, it's been an absolute disaster. The French Revolution, the Nazi Revolution, the Marxist Revolution. Whenever you try to clear the decks and start over again, things go badly. They go badly because we're not smart enough to create entirely new systems and implement them well. There's all kinds of negative consequences that we weren't expecting that happen. And there's this terrible realization that after you've replaced the old systems with the new ones, evil still remains because evil is rooted in the human heart. Watch this pattern. And so what we want as Christians, we want to seek reform. Reform is when you work with the institutions you have and you untwist what's been twisted and make them better. We can sometimes do that. We never do well when we try revolutionary means. So let's talk about how Marxism is a system of salvation without reference to God. It's what we could call an immanent religion, an immanent religiosity, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T, immanent religiosity. There's lots of immanent religiosity in America and in the West, where people conceive of life from within the immanent frame, from within this world, that there's nothing really outside of this world. And there are lots of forms of immanent religiosity. Marxism is one of those. For him, the God is material equality. Well, what is the evil? The evil is material inequality and the class struggle that comes because of inequality. The battle between the haves and the have-nots. What is the salvation for Marx? Well, it's his Marxist ideology and Marxist revolution. Who is the church? The Marxist version of church are pockets of classless people in the midst of a capitalist world. Pockets of people who have material equality and function in a communist manner, and they're a light to the nations. They're a preview of the kingdom, a preview of what could be if everyone embraces communism. Who's the priesthood for Marx? Priesthood is the Communist Party. What is the ethics that's operative in any immanent religiosity, including Marxism? It's this. The ethic is whatever it takes to achieve the revolution. So good and evil gets defined along the lines of what advances the revolution and what hinders it. And that's why concentration camps can be justified. That's why the Russian and Chinese government and the Cuban government can assassinate or imprison for long periods of time people who hinder the revolution, because there's this utilitarian ethic that if you're on the right side of history, then it's okay to crush some people on the way to taking people to the utopia. And there's also with Marxists and with other people this determinism that says, listen, these people who are in our way and won't get out of our way, these people who are saying that our ideology is wrong, they can't be reasoned with. They've been determined by their economic class, according to Marx, or by other people according to their sex or gender or race. They can't be reasoned with. They can only be coerced. They can only be silenced. They can only be punished and intimidated. And you see a lot of that in the political activism in America right now, that people will treat other people on the side of the aisle as manifestly stupid and bad. They can't be reasoned with. They can only be bullied. What was the end times for Marx? Communist utopia, that the state would wither away, be a classless society, and evil would kind of wither away with the government. So let me read what philosopher Peter Kreeft writes about Marx. It's a beautiful paragraph. He said, Marxism retains all the major structural and emotional factors of biblical religion in a secularized form. Marx, like Moses, is the prophet who leads the new chosen people, the proletariat, the working class, out of the slavery of capitalism into the promised land of communism, across the Red Sea of bloody worldwide revolution, and through the wilderness of temporary dedicated suffering for the party, the new priesthood. The messianic tone of communism makes it structurally and emotionally more like a religion than any other political system except for fascism. So briefly, I want to talk now about some contradictions and negative things that have come about because of Marxism, and then we'll conclude and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So one of the ways we can hoist Marxism by its own petard is to take its own benchmark, which is the economy, which is the course of history in relation to the economy, and judge Marxism by the course of history. And basically what we would say is that everywhere Marxism has been seriously implemented, millions of people have been crushed, the economy has gone downhill, and basically liberty has been decreased and poverty has been increased. And so that's the first criticism, is that it collapses under the weight of its own benchmark. Historically, once you abolish private property, people are not liberated but oppressed. So Marx thought that once you got rid of private property and therefore got rid of the ability of wealthy people to have so much more than people who are not wealthy, that people would be liberated. But you're not liberated. Think about it. If the government takes away from you the little bit of property you have, a home, for example, you've got nothing. You're left naked and out in the cold. You're absolutely and completely at the whims of the government. Now the government has to take care of you. You can't even have housing unless they give it to you. So it becomes something very oppressive. And because of that, Marxist states have been authoritarian and usually even totalitarian. The idol of material equality, trying to achieve material equality, this obsessive ideology, combined with the government's utter and complete power over its people. It won't let its people have property. It won't let its people have weapons for self-defense. They're completely standing naked and powerless at the hands of the government. That's why in the Soviet Union, Communist Party used systematic terror. Just from 1921 to 1953, according to Soviet history books that have now been revealed, just in those years, in those 30 years, 1.7 million Soviet citizens died in concentration camps. People were put in concentration camps because they didn't agree with the Marxist revolution. 1.7 million, 800,000 were executed, 400,000 died from forced resettlement, trying to force material equality by resettling people. Its atheistic anthropology eased the party's conscience as it annihilated its people. There was a man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and you need to read, they've got an abridged edition of the Gulag Archipelago. You can read, I wrote an article on my website on it. You can go to my website, which is bruceashford.net. Access that article. It'll give you a little bit of a reader's guide to it, and then you need to read the book. It's the first-hand reflections of a great man, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you're too young to remember him, who reflected on the phenomenon of the Soviet Union, why it happened, and why it was so bad and so awful. And here's one quote from him where he talks about the Communist Party's low view of humanity. He said, "In the mass and from a distance, all of humanity seems like swarming lice. But in fact, they are the crown of creation, right? After all, once upon a time, a weak little spark of God was breathed into them too. Is this not true? So what has become of it now?" And then he argues, he said, listen, the reason the Soviet people were able to capitulate so easily and couldn't resist is that they had had atheism beaten into their heads and forced into them over a period of decades so that their souls were weakened and they were easily pushed around by the Soviets. A few more points here. Marx's historical determinism is wrong. We are not determined by the fact that we are male or female. We're not determined in our thinking. We're not determined by the fact that we're born in America or in a different context, or by our economic class, or by our sexuality. Our thinking is not determined ahead of time. God has given us the ability to choose. Marx also misunderstands evil and sees it in systemic terms rather than in personal terms, largely in systemic terms. But evil comes from within the human heart. That was the point of the movie The Village. I don't know if you've seen The Village. It's about a people that lived out in the middle of nowhere, and you learn after you get into the movie that a group of adults who had seen too much of the bad things that happen in this life moved themselves and then their small children out in the middle of nowhere and started a village. And they told stories to their kids that made their kids afraid to ever go into civilization. And they thought that they could keep evil out of their village by keeping their families away from civilization. But then there's a murder in the village. And the point of the movie is that the evil is not primarily systemic. It's not primarily in institutions and civilization. It's in the human heart. Marx's atheism and historical determinism combine to give us a moral relativism, a utilitarian ethic that says you can justify anything you do as long as you're doing it on behalf of the revolution. Then finally, we just want to point out again and give some and expand on the fact that Marxism has delivered exactly the opposite of what it promised. And that's what false religions and ideologies do. They promise you a salvation and they give you a God, but it's a counterfeit God who can never deliver. And what you get in the end is bad, not good. So Marxism has made countries poor. Not just Soviet Union, but Cuba, for example. Even as Fidel Castro, even in his funeral, the car that was carrying him broke down. Nothing worked well in Cuba. Nothing worked well in the Soviet Union. They did do pretty well with missiles after they stole technology from us and so forth, but there was just no incentive to do things well. You take away all of people's incentives when you don't let them get the fruit of their labor. You can't plan an economy centrally. Marx thought that you could, but Soviet Union's leaders thought that you could determine the price of eggs in the countryside and tractors and determine the price of oil, and when they tried to do so, the whole thing fell apart because the value of something comes from how much people would be willing to pay for it. And so, we don't have time to give all the numbers here, but I would say this: in a 3-year period from 1930 to 1933, more than 5 million Soviet citizens starved to death right after the Marxist Revolution. So things got worse, not better. Now, as we conclude and maybe have a few minutes for Q&A, Marxism, just concluding summary, Marxism deified material equality. Anytime you deify something that's not God, then that one thing that you've made into a God becomes a cudgel that beats down other good aspects of God's reality. So once you've deified material equality becomes a God, and it's a bad God, and it beats down other good aspects of God's world, such as freedom to choose, such as freedom to earn money and gain wealth. No idol, hear me, no idol, material equality or any other aspect of God's creation can bear the weight of our hopes and dreams. Only Christ can bear the weight of our hopes and dreams. So utopia will never come in the here and now. No revolution can bring salvation. We've got to be satisfied with reform rather than revolution. Utopia will come only when someone greater is on the throne. And so, if you're interested in reading more on this, I wrote a book called Letters to an American Christian. It's a series of 27 letters I wrote to a college student who had just become a Christian, coaching this college student on all of the different, basically, disputes that we have right now, socially, culturally, and politically. It's out on a half-off sale on Amazon right now for $8. It's easy to read. It's a trade book, so I would point you to that. Also, if you want to read a book specifically on Marxism, Peter Kreeft wrote a book called Socrates Meets Marx, and it's a pretty good hoisting of Marx by his own petard. If you want a more academic book, there is that goes after Marx. There's a book called Political Visions and Illusions by political scientist David Koizis. He's a Kuyperian political scientist. It's a very smart book. He actually goes after 4 or 5 political ideologies and does so as a political scientist. Very, very much well worth a read. So there are a few suggestions. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes, I think, to do some Q&A. If you want to ask. Oh, do we? We got some more time than that? Okay, great. Country, but I will be willing to give it my best shot on any ideas or issues, whether it relates to Marxism or is some other political issues in our nation. And there might be I might have to say I don't know. I'm not the world's premier expert in Marx. I've done a lot of reading in his original, in primary sources and in secondary, but I may have to, on some things, say I'm not sure. Good question. But so let me open up the floor. And if you would, if you have a question, stand up. Let me know your name, and then fire away. Who's going to be the first? Yes, sir. Yeah. So the phrase cultural Marxism has come up, and I think different people mean different things by it. But one generalized way of describing what many people mean by cultural Marxism is that certain elements of Marxist thought are taken out of the economic context and placed into a different context. So Marx was a historical determinist who thought that people are determined by their economic class, or almost determined by it. Maybe he was a soft determinist. And therefore, you stereotype people when you meet them based upon their economic class, and you know that they probably can't be reasoned with, and maybe what they need is to be shouted down, mocked, and humiliated, pushed around. Well, some people now take that view of things and apply it not to economic class, but ethnic heritage. It's okay to stereotype people by their ethnic heritage, and you know that this person can't help but think in such and such a way because he's white, or because he's black, or because he's brown. And so therefore they've got, often are going to have to be punished and humiliated and shouted down. Or maybe it's gender. You know, so-and-so can't help but think the way he thinks. He's a man. Or maybe it's not gender, but it's sexual preference. And so that's one way of describing what people often mean by the phrase cultural Marxism. I think that's a bad way of going about things, to give permission to yourself to stereotype other people rather than seeing them in their individuality. I mean, it is true that there can be a helpfulness to knowing a person's gender or sexual preference or their race or their economic class. Those factors do influence a person's way of thinking and seeing the world. But to think that people's thought are determined by that, and to give yourself permission to stereotype somebody and then dismiss them, it's a bad way. It's what American politics is built on right now. When I write an opinion piece for Fox or for the Daily Signal or Daily Caller or for my website, 90% of the responses that I get, either in the comments or in emails that are sent to me or on Twitter or on Facebook, 90% are mockery and insults that don't deal with what I said in the article. They just stereotype me based on my Twitter byline. Oh, you write for Fox News. You must be a very dumb person and a jerk. Or oh, white guy, sure. Of course you're going to say that. You're the white guy. Or, oh, you work for, you must make a lot of money. I've never made a dime from Fox. I don't make any money from any of the outlets, new media outlets that I write for. My opinion is not controlled. But people are perfectly willing to assume things about you. I'm going beyond your question, but I'm a little ticked off right now. So here's what's happening. On both sides of the political aisle, you've got an enormous amount of polarization. The media outlets make an enormous amount of money on the polarization because anger and fear, which is what happens when you polarize, anger and fear are incredible motivators, and they keep us clicking on the websites, listening to the radio shows, and watching the TV shows. And that's how the media outlets get their ad revenue. And that's the only reason they exist, is to make money, since we live in a warped capitalist system with immoral actors controlling all kinds of things in our country. And so you've got this polarization. When polarization happens, what people tend to do is they look at all the mean, bad people who want to destroy our country on the other side of the aisle. We take any bad instances of things that have happened by anyone on the other side of the aisle, and we take all those bad things and we put them together in a personality profile. Then we place that personality profile on everybody who's on the other side of the aisle, so they all look like monsters. It's why when I go on a conservative radio show, it can't even be tolerated by the host if I give a compliment to anyone who's a Democrat. Barack Obama never did anything good at any point ever in his life. Now, I disagree with nearly everything that he did in office, but even if I say something like, it appears that he's a good husband and father. No, you'll find out later he's cheated on his wife with 47 women. And the same thing vice versa. If anyone says anything positive about Donald Trump, for people on the left, then they're a fascist who loves Hitler and would love to, go get in Hitler's grave with him and hug him for a while. And this is just a very stupid way, very stupid and bad way to go about political discourse, and Christians have got to find we've got to find a better path than that. I wrote an article on right after Trump was elected, and I wanted someone other than Trump. I wanted somebody, a Marco Rubio or a Ted Cruz or really anybody. I know on the right, I was not a fan. He's done better than I thought on a couple things, and religious liberty and Supreme Court justices. We're very grateful for things he said on pro-life, but he was not my favorite. But I wrote an article on Inauguration Day for Fox that said, listen, whenever an elected official goes into office, as Christians, we owe three things. People who oppose that leader owe him or her our prayers and our goodwill. And our integrity demands that we point out whenever that person does and says things that are right. On the other hand, people who pulled for that person and admired that person, integrity demands that they be willing to critique whenever that person says and does wrong. And then my third point was just that we should all pray for our leaders. And I just don't think we're doing that. I think toward the last president and toward this president, if you don't like him, you all just have to line up and beat him around the head every time he says or does anything. If you do like him, you have to praise everything that he says and does and never criticize. And that's just not a Christian way of going about things. It lacks integrity. We've got to find a better way. I won't answer all the questions at length like this, but you really teed me up, man. You got me going. All right. Yes. So, Marxism is a variety of socialism. It's the most famous variety. Marx was not the first socialist. There were other socialists, and he certainly is not the last. And so there are many kinds of socialism. Some are built more on a philosophy than on a purportedly scientific model. Some run on a more scientific model than philosophical. Some socialists want a revolution, and some don't. And so it's very difficult to describe. It's just such a broad array. If you'd like a good, concise description of types of socialism, buy David Koizis' book, Political Visions and Illusions. Make sure to buy the second edition, just released this past year. Let's talk about some of the varieties on offer in America. You want to do that? Maybe that's a good thing to do, that differ from Marx. Bernie, I don't know if any of you in here are feeling the burn, but I'm not. I do think that Bernie does believe, one thing, a little bit of respect that I'll give to him is I do think that he believes what he says. He's a true believer. I mean, he took his honeymoon in the Soviet Union. You really got to believe to take your honeymoon in such a desolate wasteland of poverty and oppression, but he did. So I do think that he's got some integrity. But I don't think he's a socialist. He's a social democrat is what he is. He's a person who wants a basically capitalist framework with an enormous amount of redistribution of wealth. And this model only works in the short term by kicking the ball down the road, by spending money you don't have so that your children and grandchildren have to pay the price for it. Now, there are some real socialists in America, the Democratic Socialists of America. You can go look at their website. What do they want? Well, they want social control of the means of production. They want the government to take over everything. water and the electricity and other things. They do want to allow some private business, but with the government exerting ideological control. So it doesn't go as far as Marxism. There's going to be some private businesses. They want to give over also health care to the government. You really don't want to do that. Look at the countries where the government controls health care. And what you'll see is that the doctors have less motivation to spend 8 years of their life in medical school because there's very little compensation for it. And so the skill and the quality tend to go down. And then people are less motivated to earn money in that sort of a situation since the government's paying for everything. And what you end up with is lines of, you have to get in line for 6 or 8 months to get your teeth cleaned, you know, because the dentists aren't working hard because they know they're going to make some money putting in extra hours. I mean, nobody goes, yeah. So you talk to someone in more socialist countries about health care. And on the one hand, they're, I guess, grateful that they don't have to pay for it, but on the other hand, they're very bothered by the quality of it and how long they have to wait to get the health care. They want to abolish the Senate. They want to abolish anything hierarchical. They want equality of every sort. And I think as Christians, we want to recognize people's equality before God, equality of value, but we can never achieve a non-hierarchical society. In fact, God wants society to have hierarchies. In fact, the family unit is hierarchical. This is where we learn to live within a hierarchy. A child learns to negotiate with authorities, to obey authorities, and to negotiate with them by being the child of a parent. A child learns to negotiate with siblings. A child learns to be a citizen, in short, by being in a family. And there will always be hierarchy in society, but socialists want to get rid of it. And that's why they don't want the Senate, because the Senate is not as representative as the House of Representatives is. Democratic, on the one hand, the Democratic Socialists of America has grown by, a year ago, it was 7 times as big as it was in the course of 4 years, but still only had like 50,000 members. I don't know how much it's grown since then, but the growth rate is pretty big. And you've got some big names who are members of the DSA or who tweet out on behalf of it. Rob Delaney is a Twitter comedian who now basically the only thing he does is rant against evangelicals and political conservatives, who's got a couple million followers. And so you've got some big influencers pushing the DSA. In the short term, they want to elect DSA candidates through the Democratic Party. They know they can't elect on their own platform, so they'll enter as Democrats. They want to do Medicare for all. They want to make labor unions bigger. They want to give free college for everybody. Can you imagine that? How in the world do you pay for that? You go into an enormous amount of debt as a government, and then you let your children and grandchildren get taxed at a 50% rate years down the road. They want a government-mandated wage. You know there's problems with that, right? All right, everybody earns $75 an hour. Well, everybody is not worth $75 an hour. Everybody doesn't work equally hard. Everybody isn't equally adept. And so in the minute you force that, then companies just adjust their prices higher so that they can make the salary higher. So the market goes into a convulsion for 5 years, and then 5 years later it's equalized out. And if you had to triple the salary of your worker, you triple the price of your product. It just doesn't work to mandate in that manner. And they want universal basic income, which doesn't work in the same manner. So that's different than Marxism. They aren't completely taking away private property, thank God. That's not what they want to do completely. And then Bernie, who's called a socialist, really isn't. He's a social democrat. Also not a good path. Who's the next? Yes, sir, right there. Yeah, that's a very good question. Questions about humor and satire. I want to write an article. Writing is how I learn. And I can't give a great answer to this yet. The only thing I can do is give some parameters. Because so on the one hand, a lot of the political discourse that we see is just berating and mocking other people, humiliating them and degrading them. And it's kind of a universal language of political discourse right now. It's either mockery or insult. When a person sets forth their views, you assume the worst of their intentions and their intellect, or both. And that's not a good way of going about things. And yet, at the same time, I do think it's okay to use humor. And sometimes it's hard to delineate, but the humor shouldn't be used with the purpose of degrading the other person. It could be used to show the wrongness of a position or to persuade. Humor is powerfully persuasive. If you can get people to laugh at a certain position, you've won. Now, if it becomes something laughable, you've won the day, if you don't want that view to succeed. But humor has to be used in such a way that it doesn't degrade the image of God in a person. And I know that's not very specific. I mean, that's hard to discern, but that's my best shot at answering. Because humor is the ability to see what it is that's off kilter and to point it out. What is it that's just not right about this situation? And then to point it out in a very deft manner with an image or with human language. And so it is by nature a good way of showing something that's off kilter about a person's view or what's off kilter about society. But I think we need to be careful how we use it. All right, we've got time for one or two more questions. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Yeah. You know, I think one reason socialism is popular is that we don't teach history very well in America. And people who are under the age of 30 don't remember how bad socialism has been in so many parts of the world. And so there's not historical context. There's these amazing promises. There's this guy with crazy hair on television, his glasses falling off of his nose, who really cares about the working class. And I think he does. And he's going to look at it. He says we can have free college. This is amazing. Free health care. Health care is really expensive, and so is college. I mean, this is going to save us hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he says that we can pay for it. It's not a problem. That the wealthy people who hate us, they can all pay for it. So you can see why it appeals to people under the age of, say, 35. There's no historical experience. We don't teach history very well in school. When we do teach it, it's revisionist history, so there's no context. Then a second reason that I think is that many or most Americans, even if they call themselves religious, live their life manage our lives without any real reference to God. We don't really need Him when we're sick because we have good doctors in America, because we're capitalist. And we don't need Him to protect us from the elements because we have nice houses and nice cars. We've made ourselves such a nice world, we don't need Him. And so we're very susceptible to systems of salvation ideologies that don't give any reference to God. We have a lot of confidence in the human mind to be able to take great leaps forward. And so when we hear of this, all these smart people that say, hey, we can really pull this off, we tend to believe them because smart people have sent someone to the moon. And smart people have made nice automobiles and huge houses. And so we've got this confidence in people's ability rationally to get together and manage society. If you're a thinker and you like to read books, there's a book by Thomas Sowell, S-O-W-E-L-L, called Conflict of Visions. And he describes two different ways of approaching society and culture and politics, the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. The constrained vision says that we have some constraints. We're fallen and we're finite. And because we're fallen, evil exists in the heart, and we can't get rid of it by fixing our institutions. And because we're finite, we're not smart enough to overhaul society. That's the constrained vision. So we work from reform. We work to reform from within. The unconstrained vision thinks that humanity can take a great leap forward, that we're not fallen, and that we're not that finite, and that the smartest minds can help us take a quantum leap forward. We can evolve. And therefore, they make big, grand plans to take a great leap forward. So lack of historical perspective and imminent religiosity, unconstrained visions for what humanity can do. I think those are two of the reasons. Well, this has been great. Yes, sir. Okay. Right. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. To counteract it. Right. Good question. So I would divide my answer into two categories. One is what do we do with history classes, and the other is what do we do with the rest of the curriculum. With history courses, so in terms of pedagogical theory, I believe that when we're teaching optimally, young children need to focus on memorizing content blocks of information. And then as you progress, they need to learn to analyze that information. They learn reason. They need to learn logic. You don't learn logic before you have information because you don't have any information to work with. So memory comes first, and then analysis, and then after that comes communication. And the problem is we receive students who have had not much of any of that in history. So I think history courses in college have to include memorization of timelines because students come in with empty heads, like empty wagon, just clanging, clattering along, nothing in there. And so we have to, I think, memorization of timelines. History professors have it so hard because they have to do what should have been done for 12 years before they receive the student has to be done in 1 year. So there's got to be some memorization, then there has to be some analysis of that information, and then some ability to communicate it. So good luck. I don't know how you do that. But then the other thing that needs to happen in the other disciplines is I think it's very helpful in other disciplines in an introductory class to give the history of the discipline. Very important. How did the discipline start? The social sciences started most of the time in an attempt to replace God and religion. That's not a good start. And I'm not against the social sciences, I'm for them. I'm for Christian forms of them. And so how did the discipline get its start? And then how has it morphed and evolved along the way? And so then all of these classes are reinforcing what they get in their basic history courses. World history or Western Civ, American history, whatever they're taking. And by the time they get out after 4 years, there should be some sort of all of that information should have coalesced to give a student pretty good perspective. And while we're at it, let me tell you why your history courses are so important and why I wished I'd paid better attention in history. If you know history, then you have a perspective on any topic that can ever come up in conversation. If you know history, then you have something to say or a way of thinking about pretty much anything that happens. Because history, in one sense, is just one dang thing after another. And there are kind of cycles to history. History is linear. It's moving toward an end when Christ will return. But there's a way in which it cycles. The same kind of things happen over and over again, and history gives so much perspective. So pay attention in your history class, unless you would like to be a dimwit for the rest of your life. Do we have any history profs in here? You're welcome. Pay attention to that man's class. So you guys have been great. I want to thank you so much for paying attention. I'm going to say a brief prayer to close us out. Father, we pray in the name of your Son, who entered into history and brought a historic salvation, and who will return one day to bring an end to history as we know it. And he will install a one-world government and a one-party system in which justice will roll down like the waters, and in which you are seated on the throne. And we long for that day. We pray that you help us to live in such a way that it gives people a glimpse of what that day will be like. Pray for your blessing on this college, on the president, cabinet, faculty, the staff, and the students. In the name of your Son we pray. Amen. Free to go. Thank you.